Welcome to Exiles, a Gospel of Mark podcast. We're coming to you from Grace Church in Erie, Pennsylvania, where we're taking what we learn about ancient truths and the person of Jesus into our everyday life. You can check out whoisgrace.com/Mark for the sermon and resources that we're using for our conversation today. Thanks for joining us for season 3. We're in the section of Mark that we're calling the Jesus Way. It's going to run throughout the summer. It's about 3 months in length, so it's a good chunk altogether. We're following Jesus through Galilee as he continues his teaching and healing work while training his disciples and facing down the opposition as that increases. Welcome.
Welcome.
So today, full disclosure. Today, full disclosure, we're coming off of like a really cool staff training that we got to do. And it is around sponsor alert. Patrick Lencioni's book, Working Genius. And it's all about how
The Working Genius?
Sorry. You would know.
We also have, I think, Caffeinated Steven.
Caffeinated Steven's with us
Steven
today.
may or may not be
That's
coming
how you
back from Chicago, an 8-hour drive with his team.
Chicago.
This morning.
Chicago.
Yeah, so basically this book's all about how work gets done and how we as individuals kind of fit in to the process. So I thought just real quick, we don't have to get like full into the weeds on it, but like anything that you learned about yourself today that you want to share when you say who you are on the podcast? Or you can say you're working genius, why you agree, disagree, something like that. Okay. Right. Do it.
Danielle and I found out that we're identical twins.
We are identical. And Sarah.
Yep.
Sarah who?
Bert.
What?
We're
Yeah,
all
No
three.
way.
You guys
We're
are all in
100%
there.
identical.
The same
My eye,
geniuses.
Is that
same
why
all
you're wondering
three.
if mine is the same?
Oh.
All three.
That's weird.
All three are the
She
same.
is an ID? But she doesn't like inventing, does she?
Do we have the paper?
She
I don't have
does.
the paper. I don't remember what all of them are.
What?
I almost brought it in.
Guys, I was clearly not there.
Yeah,
'cause
Stephen
I
was-
was driving
Stephen was
back, so
driving,
I'm
but-
learning this for the first
Spirit.
time.
Yeah, you, me, and
What?
Sarah are the same.
That's creepy, the three of you, and then you work
We're
so
on the
closely
same
together.
team. Yeah, that
Yeah.
explains
It's either
a lot.
like,
But it works because we have very specific
Does it?
lanes also.
it's either perfect or terrifying. So.
Well, it's both. It
It
depends.
works.
Yeah.
It does.
Well, my name is Mike. I'm one of the pastors
Oh,
here
yeah,
at Grace.
names.
I'm a D and a T, so discerning. So I don't like to like head in the clouds, like come up with new things. But I like when there's a list of ideas, and I like to poke at them and help find the right one.
Aaron Lumberg is that as well.
He is, so that's probably not
I'm
wildly
not
surprising.
surprised by that,
Yeah,
No.
I didn't think you guys would be. And then I'm tenacity.
Yeah, nice.
So like getting like checklists and getting things off. That's when I like to just turn off my brain and feel productive, and I can just pop.
And you resonate with that.
Love that. Clear
Great.
the inbox. Like
It's
feel
true. You're
accomplished.
always like very
Nice.
like
What were
at
your frustrations?
Wonder and invention.
Oh,
so
okay,
like
yeah.
pie in the sky, head in the clouds. I wonder what. So
Cool. Okay. What about you, Sarah?
Hi, I'm Sarah. I am a what I was going to say enabler, and that's not right.
Yeah, it is.
Enablement
Yes,
and
enablement.
galvanizing.
So you're like all about the people, basically.
All
side of
about the people.
tasks.
And then my frustration was wonder and
did you forget?
I think it might be discernment.
Could be.
I
Like you don't want to make the decision. No. Yeah.
No.
That's
And I
fair.
don't want to wonder.
Yeah, so you're all about the people. That makes sense for you.
Total sense.
Morale of the
your
room.
Competencies are T and
T tenacity.
D.
I.
Yes, invention, yeah.
Yeah. Maybe
Come and
invention.
meet
Maybe
the
invention and wonder.
better
No, I don't.
people.
You guys,
Sorry,
I
this
don't
is
know. I'll
so
get back to
confusing
you.
for all
We
of
didn't
you.
just
This
spend
is
4
really
hours
bad
doing
I think
content.
it's because I've looked at them all like so many times.
Yeah, sure. Yeah, Steve and I are the same. I and D.
That's why.
All 6 the same? Like
All
in
6
order?
the same. I think we flipped the
Yeah,
D
we
and the
flipped
I, right?
Yeah, the first.
You're
first
DI,
two,
I'm
DI.
ID.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So, I mean, if people don't understand,
Yeah.
obviously, because this is a podcast, so not everybody might be familiar. It's not necessarily a personality tool
Right.
where Strength Finder will kind of tell you who you are. This is more about what brings you life in the cycle of a project.
Getting work done, yeah.
Getting work done. So working as a team. And widget is wonder, invention, discernment, galvanizing, enablement, and tenacity. And that is the typical lifestyle of every project. You have to first wonder, then you have to invent the idea, discern whether it's good or they're good, galvanize people around it, enable them to work, and then get it across the finish line. So that's kind of the linear progression of a project. So as we talk about where we sort of land on that scale.
And we all have all of it, but it's just what
That's
drains
correct.
you first, right?
Yep.
Is the
And what
would be more
fulfills you,
frustrating.
gives
what
you joy.
fulfills you, yeah. Yeah, super interesting.
Yeah.
I think
so if you
there's-
haven't read it, go.
Yeah,
grab the
read
book.
it. There's
I
also
think it'll
like
be
free
really
online
helpful.
quizzes. Yeah, I think it's helpful. Also, just getting work done. Again, not personality, but even like
Right.
household, getting work done in your house. It's helpful.
Yeah. So Nicole and
clarifying.
I took it, and you may have done it with your spouses
With
as well.
Nicole.
And it was just it gave us so much language to why we
Yeah.
both feel frustrated at certain times,
What
and
was
even
she?
certain
Do you
times
remember?
of the day. So she is a GD. So she's a galvanizer,
Galvanizing
but she also
discernment.
likes to discern, which is interesting because I'm a DI. So I've typically discerned the ideas that I come up with. So when I come to her and she wants to discern, I'm not ready for her to discern. So I usually get frustrated at her discernment because she picks it apart.
She
But it's
rediscerns your
already
discernment.
perfect. So why would she pick it apart? So
This was a
Just
point
seems
today.
so
Like
confusing.
the ID people need other ID people, or you
100%.
can't come up with good
yeah,
ideas.
or you can, you get lost.
Yeah.
Yeah. So we found that, and I found in our 10 years of marriage that her discernment is typically spot on, especially with people. She discerns people very well and accurately, and that's not necessarily great on my radar at times. And so, yeah, it's been really helpful to learn to listen to my wife.
Yeah.
In those areas.
Did you hear that, Nicole?
Wow, and podcast.
Yeah.
To your wife.
Love
I need
you.
to
You're
make
right.
Emily
Yeah.
do this.
Yeah.
I'm almost scared of what she'll come back with.
Yeah, Dave's a WE very quickly. Dave's a WE. One example of how this works. He's WE, I'm ID, right? So I picked a flight to California, cheapest flight I've ever found in my life. All three of us can fly from the East Coast to the West Coast for $500. All three of us.
Wow.
And he's
What
like,
airline?
are we sure we want to do this?
Were you actually sitting in a seat?
What? Yeah, at my house.
We're in the storage
Well,
area?
no, Dax is just shoved
No,
away.
no, we're in a seat. It's a seat. It's
Wow,
like
good for
whatever.
you.
Yeah. And no, he's like, well, what do we really want to do? I'm like,
What?
What I really want to do is buy this ticket right now before it turns into $800
Yes.
and $1,000. But are we sure we're doing the right thing? So that's good though, because are we sure we're doing it? Yes, we are. Let's move on. But he's still in the W,
Let's wonder,
and I'm
yeah.
like,
Full speed ahead.
let's go.
Did you get the tickets?
No, we'll be doing that today. Mark my
Have you
words.
been checking it all day to see if it's still $500?
No, I'm going to check it.
Do you want to do
I
it right
told him
now,
like
or-
we can't wait past anyway. Okay. Speaking of sin, today's big idea is to monitor the condition of your own heart more than you monitor the behavior of others.
Oh, wow. What a segue.
Wow, perfect, right?
Convicting.
Yeah. So it is convicting. I mean, I feel like we could leave it at the big idea and talk about that for a good half hour. Pastor Eric was making the point. Let's hone in on the context a little bit here. If somebody else wants to do that, that's fine. Probably Mike. Just that when we're talking about this section of scripture, where the Pharisees were coming from, versus like it wasn't like the disciples were breaking these laws that are like long-standing written laws, right? What were they breaking?
So there's the law, the Torah in the Old Testament that God gave the Israelites, and they were following that, of course. But over time, and then a couple different exiles in between, and then so it had been, I think thousands of years at this point since the law was first given, and over time, the law, the elders had just kind of added on bit by bit. Right? If we don't want to do this, well, then let's not do that. Well, or that. And let's like build a bunch of slippery slope of to make sure we don't break the law. But over time, that maybe those good ideas, and what I thought was really cool, Derek said was like there was good initiative there, like just maybe poor judgment. And over time, now all of a sudden, there's this big complex structure of these laws that now held equal weight with the laws that God had given. And so, in any case, the context of this was then when Jesus just having a conflict with the Pharisees, and the Pharisees asking, why don't your disciples wash their hands? And one of those many elders' laws that had risen in importance. And Jesus was like, but that's not real.
That's not what we're talking about.
Right.
It's not real. Yeah.
So side note, I think what's really interesting, it's like the law of fundamentalism or the law of legalism. And I think what's important for any believers listening, I think it's important to just point out that fundamentalism or legalism can live on either side of the theological spectrum. So typically you would go, oh, the more Reformed people are legalistic and the charismatic people are more free. But there's a form of legalism across the entire spectrum, which I think is really interesting. But the law of legalism would say that it's about a 20-year span from an organizational standpoint that sin will creep in. So the good intentions that you set up within your, I don't want to say religious structure, but if you will, within your religious structure to maybe protect the people, to keep them safe, to keep them walking towards holiness, give it 20 years without some level of accountability or evaluation, and you've wandered into fundamentalism or legalism. So
Wow.
I think it's as you look across like the history of America and the history of Christianity, you can see those trends. So
And all those, the different structures put in place with very good intentions in mind to protect against maybe a very specific
100.
sin or temptation that had been an issue, solve that. But I mean, Satan knows what he's doing, and he can get in there and take the best of intentions and over time, like you said, twist it into legalism. And yeah.
So anyway,
No, you're great.
Low 2 cents.
No, it's great. And we're talking about avoiding hypocrisy because we're saying monitoring. It's more important to monitor the condition of your own heart than others, right? So he also gives us a three-part journey toward avoiding hypocrisy. So number one is embrace your need to be spiritually clean. His question there that I wrote down is, what is my strategy for dealing with the stain of sin? Because we all have a strategy. The Pharisee strategy, the structure is just keep washing and keep washing and keep washing and keep washing, and then wash that, then wash that, then wash that, and eventually, hopefully, when we get to the end of it, you'll be clean. So what have you guys seen? Like it could be your own personal experience or things that you've seen in other people. What are strategies that we see for dealing with the stain of sin versus embracing our need to be spiritually clean?
Effective strategies or ineffective
Either way.
strategies? Either
Yeah.
one.
Oh, in lieu of?
Yeah, like so. I think one example he gave was like you might turn to like some coping mechanism or something like that, or
Oh, gotcha.
you know what I'm saying? Yeah.
Well, I know, there's almost too much silence and I jumped in.
That's right.
So I know, I mean, we'll get real here. For men, pornography is an issue, and not just men actually, but pornography
Actually, yeah,
is an issue
statistically not.
in our culture. And so there's literally an industry about like accountability software or programs that you can like Christian accountability software that will help
heard of that, yeah.
keep you from going to explicit sites or whatever. So you can set all these filters up and that's good. However, I mean, Stephen's favorite verse, right? The heart is deceitfully wicked among all other things. Like, if you're not going inside and changing what's on the inside, you'll find a way. You'll find the way to get around some of those filters and stuff. So that's one issue that I've encountered
Yeah, that's good.
multiple times.
That's a good example.
Yeah, and I think what's also important is to recognize the action is usually in response to an emptiness or a void that somebody is feeling. And so, I mean, if we're using pornography just as an example, it's not necessarily because that person struggles with lust. It might actually be because that person struggles with loneliness.
Right. Good point.
And so it's so often we have the tendency to address the sin at face value and say, well, there, A plus B equals C. And it may, I'm not saying that we throw that out, but I think what's also true, especially for men, is that, in a culture where men are not necessarily encouraged to talk, I think it's definitely getting better. I think when you scratch past a few layers, you actually see that there's a deeper issue going on. And I've had several friends who their life has come crumbling down, but after they've gone to counseling, they've realized that, oh my God, I didn't even realize this about myself. I didn't even realize that I was carrying this emotional baggage, and 3 layers up, the byproduct was pornography.
Wow. Yeah.
And so I think we have to be aware of the deeper levels that exist within us, and not necessarily just take things at face value.
And
That's good.
So to make my more, to make like a personal example out of that. So I've anger issues and have had anger issues. And so for a long time, it was me, and especially once I had my girls, I got 4 and 2-year-old daughters, and like, I got to get a hold of these anger issues and stop having to patch up drywall all over the place and get a new, whatever. But it wasn't until I like actually went that layer beneath and started getting counseling and started what this anger is a symptom. What's the actual root sinful cause there? And until I, first of all, became willing to face it, then became aware of it, and then started addressing that, then some of those outlying sinful, manifestations started to resolve themselves because I wasn't just on the outside, washing, but went on the inside.
That's good.
Yeah. Did you find that they first started to make sense before you found resolution?
The
reason why?
Yeah, the
Oh,
reason
yeah.
why. Yeah.
As like, and digging through and like with a counselor and like doing my own work. Yeah, like, oh, I could see how maybe not A plus B equals C, but like A led to B, led to C, led to D. And honestly, it was a lot more work than I thought it would be.
Counseling always is a lot of work.
Good work, but it was a lot.
Oh, it's so much fun.
Yeah. So I think you asked a question.
I love counseling
You
so
love it?
much. I love therapy, yes.
The question you asked was what are some tools? So counseling could be one.
That could be a positive tool.
I think what was really helpful. So we came back from a tech and creative conference just today, and we had some really good conversations as a team about the necessity of keeping the narrative open. And so, what does it look like for us as a team to know that it's not a one-way street? So for me, as essentially their supervisor or their boss, it's not one-way stream down, but it's actually both way, that I need to be hearing from them.
That's good.
So I think you can apply that into this type of situation as well. That I think, counseling, we can say community, but I think more specifically, you need a community that fosters a two-way narrative. So you need to have people in your life that you're not afraid to just be honest with.
Yeah, safety and
that's really difficult, especially if you consider yourself a mature Christian, right? So I've been a pastor for many years. It's very difficult for me to have a community that I can be honest with sometimes because you're afraid of, maybe the consequences of that which you may be struggling with. But it's that much more important to have that community that I can just say, hey, I'm really struggling right now, and here's how that struggle is actually playing out in my life. I've been sharp with my way, or whatever. If we're not fostering that honest narrative with a community, then we're potentially setting ourselves up for failure.
That's good. Let's move on and talk a little bit. We're already getting into this, but behavior modification. I think a lot of times we're just talking about this now. I mean, that tends to be kind of our measurement of someone's success in this area, right? And two things. One thing Pastor Derek brought up is that we have to recognize that our sinful hearts are what's wrong. The internal is what's wrong, not necessarily the external. So let's talk about that a little bit more. Thoughts on that? My mind kind of went to like culture war kind of stuff. Obviously, there's evil in the world.
Yes.
Please don't like mistake that. But we sometimes, I think, fight battles that really aren't helping us in the long run. If we're doing this like virtue signaling, culture war stuff, it's not really helping our hearts, in my opinion. It doesn't help my heart. Anyway, I guess I'll say that much.
Because primarily what we're addressing in those wars, if you will, is behavior modification. Is that?
Well, we're addressing things that are like attacking us or the family,
Okay.
or whatever issue you want to take. And I'm not saying those things aren't happening, but really it's our personal internal burden, what we do with those things. There's a lot of benign objects in the world too, right? Like there are tons of things that aren't evil or good.
They're just neutral.
They're just neutral. And we do something with those things, and then that's where that quote unquote uncleanliness comes, I think. That makes sense.
Yeah, that's good. Where my brain goes, I mean, I've said this plenty of times on this podcast, but a child of the 90s, Christian child of the 90s, and I think what we've seen is a lot of behavior modification there, but I think what we're seeing now on the back end is behavior modification not working.
Right. We're inheriting.
Because you're now living through a culture of ex-evangelicals.
Yeah.
And I know many people who have walked away from their faith because, their dad didn't allow them to say fart, growing up. And it's a real thing.
Stupid.
It's real.
But, dad was hiding a secret sin.
Right.
And that eventually came out. And they're like, well, our family may have looked perfect. There was a lot of shame and a lot of pressure there.
Yeah.
And now there's a hypocrisy that is exposed. And behavior modification cannot be the answer, because it's not sustainable. And I think that's what people need to hear.
Yeah.
It may be sustainable even for 50 years, but I think, God disciplines those that he loves. And so I think that he, in his love, will expose the hypocrisy so that we don't die just adjusting our behavior.
Yeah.
But the belief in the core essence of who we are is actually beginning to change.
Yeah,
because God in his love cares for us enough to address that. So I think that's that's the fragility, if you will, of behavior modification.
Yeah.
When it's easier. It's easier.
Measurable. Yeah.
It's measurable.
Measurable. It's to put all these roadblocks and boundaries in and be really rigid, and it's easier to see things black and white and to ignore the gray, or just kind of side everything into one or the other, but not do that hard work. In the short term, it's easier. Yeah. Takes less effort. In the long term, and again, I can speak, and there's many people who can speak to when you dig and you address some of that sinful piece of your heart. Boy, in the long term, it's way
better.
Way better, but it's easier in the short term to just go, I'm just going to...
Yeah. There's for any parents that's listening, any parents that are listening, not as listening, but for any parents that are listening, there's a really good book by Paul Tripp that's just called Parenting. And we read it before, having Marlo, and it was just... It gets at I was looking for an A + B = C,
of course.
because that's the tendency. Like, how do I parent well? But it's a beautiful book of just like reminding the parent of what's actually going on. Like, there's this little guy, protesting for independence, and that's actually why he's behaving the way that he's behaving. So it's not like you don't do this. It's like, remember the root that's actually going on. So it was a really good reminder. It doesn't necessarily satisfy, how to be a good parent, but it's a great reminder of like, okay, remember, this is what's going on in your kid's heart potentially. And so you may want to, before you say, don't do that, you may want to, come at it from a different angle because of, what might actually be going on underneath the surface.
And that's one of my biggest revelations for Emily and I has been, as we parent our girls, the best parenting book I've ever read wasn't Christian in the slightest. It's called Hunt, Gather, Parent. Fantastic. She was actually this woman who did studies with these different indigenous cultures, and saw how they raised their kids and compared it to the Western way. And she actually didn't know it, but she was espousing a lot of Christian ideals in there. But
that'll happen.
general revelation. But reading that book, she called out like the Western parenting culture is often primarily about control, and you want to control your kid's behavior, and that then in later life kind of unravels itself in really extreme ways. And I think there's a lot of similarity between, if we try to control our own behavior, it's just like building tension because there's no real change on the pressure's still building. It's going to bust. And so as we parent our daughters, there are definitely plenty of things like don't do that, do this, but it's why do you want to do this? What? Let's get at the heart issue. Oh, you don't. Yeah, I know you want Panda, but you had Panda for 5 minutes, and it's Isabel's turn. We need to share because Jesus shared. And so it's funny that the things I do, and then I walk away and I'm like, crap, I should probably do that for myself.
Oh, so many times. Well, and not to get super meta on it either, but then you have that layer of it, and then you have the layer of laying your own expectations on the kid as well. Well, this is not what God does to us. This is our thing. Where then their perceived, how we've modified their behavior is a reflection on us, how good or bad of a parent we are or human we are. And then that can sometimes have you double down on that, like, stop it, don't, blah, 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 be a little soldier kind of a thing.
Yeah, so often I find myself going, we don't raise those kinds of kids. And then I'm like,
no.
Stop.
Yeah.
Like, this is not what the Hayes do. But we had a moment with Marlo. It was really interesting a little while ago, probably a couple of months ago, where he was going somewhere with his buddy. But he had a really hard time going in the car with them. Like, he didn't want to be picked up by his buddy's grandparents and it was really interesting, but I found myself like getting frustrated.
Sure.
And in God's providence, I did this thing right. But I sat on the stairs with him because
why?
and it was just almost like he was protesting. But then he started to cry, and I'm like, what's going on? And anyway, we were able to talk through things, and I gave him options. I showed him my hands. I'm like, is it this? Is it this? And we're actually able to it was just like,
Could he just not find his little words for how he felt?
He had never really been in the car with anybody else but us.
you. Uh-huh.
And so there was this
That's scary. Okay.
it's a little bit scary, you know. And we were actually able to get to the surface, to the root of it. But had I not, in God's providence, paused, I probably would have been like, stop being
Get in the car.
Just get in the car.
Drive me nuts.
Stop whining, or whatever. And so often that's where we default. But it was just this neat reminder to be like, and it was a really cool practice, actually. I just thought of it off the top of my head, but it was like, okay, do you feel this or do you feel this? And he didn't even use his words. We encourage our kids to use their words because I think it's healthy. Yeah. But in that moment, he just he pointed to it, or he put his hand in my hand. So it was like, is it this or is it this? And if it was none, I'm like, if it's none, don't put, and then I would try some more options. It worked really well. It was like a parent win, the few that you have.
Yeah, that's great.
But it was really helpful.
You helped him diagnose the root cause that was manifesting itself.
And even as adults, we'll feel things, but we have no idea what words to use. So imagine being a little kid and not being able to describe what you're feeling.
And that's God too. With us, he's like, oh my gosh. If you could just take a minute and figure this out,
Be a lot
you wouldn't
better.
be doing this. Yeah.
Yeah.
That's great. Oh, sorry. So we're circling around this, but I just want to say it clearly that trying harder, it's another way to say behavior modification, I guess, fails to get at the root of it. You can try and try and try and try. And one thing that Pastor Eric said that I thought was really cool is that when you're centered around the gospel, your worth and value comes from what Jesus did. But when you're centering around behavior modification, your worth and value is based on how hard you can work and try, which is really just pick another religion.
Yeah.
There are plenty that'll accept you that will work, that ladder will work. This is not one of those.
Yeah, and you're essentially building a tower that can crumble very quickly.
Right.
When the winds come and the rains pour, it's just you're building a straw house.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's really good.
Pastor Eric also talks about the primary role of our heart, and he defined heart as the center of our person, the steering wheel, so like our soul heart. He said this, and I want to know you guys' thoughts. You worship your way through life. No matter what. So it's not just like worship on Sundays. Every decision you're making, everything you do, you're worshiping your way through life, relationships you're encountering with. Thoughts on that?
About anything. The littlest. It's okay. I guess I should ask this because this is where my head's immediately going. Hey. Daniel has a call. Just a minute. I'm going to get that. No, you can't. What are your guys' thoughts? And this may be totally in the wrong direction here. Do we believe in coincidences, or do we believe that? So for me, little things, if I'm really busy or I'm doing something or I'm going through my day and I see all these little things line up and I'm like, oh, that's so helpful. Instantly for me now, I go, thank you. I instantly believe that it's him that's just lining up my day and making these things. Or yesterday was a really stressful day for me and I had a lot of 1,000 things going on. I'm afraid I wasn't going to make, my timetable wasn't going to work out. The day was going to get too hectic and the day lined up beautifully. And I remember being really, really frustrated, but I remember kept talking myself down, you're okay, it's going to be fine, it's going to be fine. And he just kept taking care of things time after time, all day. So for me, people would look at that and be like, oh, it's a coincidence, these things just happened. But for me, it's nope, I don't believe that that's coincidence. I believe that God's literally just driving my day and all these things are lining up.
Oh, wow. That's not what I was talking about, but that's a good posture.
So I totally went out.
No, but that's the positive side of worshiping through your day, I think. That's good.
Okay,
that's
all
good.
day long, I'm reflecting on these things are happening, whether it's even bad. I mean, but it needed to happen, whatever. But you're looking at it from a point of view so in a way that is me worshiping
Yeah,
because I'm constantly focused on Jesus and thanking him throughout my day.
the object of
you.
your appreciation in those moments was God,
Right.
Girl, do
which
you
is
know how
worship,
long?
which is,
Yes.
yeah, I think that's,
Okay.
Yeah. And I think his point that he was trying to make was just like our hearts are wired to worship. So if we're not doing what you're talking about, Sarah,
I don't do it all the time.
we're going to, well, of course not. We're going to do that through other things. Like what am I expecting to get out of this relationship? What am I, what am I chasing after if it's not God? Day to day, moment to moment.
well, if we're literally created and wired to worship. And the ultimate, the only thing that will actually appease that craving to worship is God himself. But I think Calvin said our hearts are idol factories, and we'll grab after anything throughout. Like I will grab after and worship,
lie.
whether not like verbally, but like with my actions and with my thoughts, worship any number of things. What is it? We'll just keep quoting Christian, famous people, but C.S. Lewis, right? And the kid who's like playing on the sand, and he's got like the whole ocean in front of him to play, but he just wants to play with his little, dirty little sand castle. Like, but kid, you got the whole ocean. Like, don't settle for this. You can literally stare into the expanse and enjoy. So, yes, like we're wired to worship, and I find myself settling all the time.
Oh yeah, constantly.
And I've heard it put this way as well. It's not an issue of are we worshiping or not, because I don't think we have that option. It's not afforded to us.
Correct.
It's literally what are we worshiping, because we are everything that we do is an act of worship. It's either misplaced worship or it's rightly
misplaced
placed
okay.
worship. And I think that's a good lens to think through, because we relegate worship to a Sunday morning, and that's obviously we all know that at this point, if you've been in church for any length of time, that worship is much more than that. But so often that's the tendency of our heart is to go, okay, we're on now, we're worshiping, we're off now, we're no longer worshiping, but we're worshiping creatures. We are created to worship. So it's not an issue of when, it's an issue of what.
Yeah, that's good.
And I would say in that vein of thought, if you are failing, if you're trying to get at the root of your sin in your heart, but doing a quote unquote bad job at it, but you're genuinely trying to get at the root, I would honor that as more worshipful than just being successful, quote unquote, with your behavior modification.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's great.
Yeah, I think that's really good. And I think we've seen that in the Western evangelicalism, because we've seen it fall apart. These people who look good on the surface.
And these like meteoric rises.
Yes.
Yeah.
But they haven't addressed what's actually going on inside. Yeah. And it has huge consequences.
Yeah. Another quote from Pastor Derek. Our problems with sin aren't caused by our environment. It's not the way we're raised or the culture we're in or anything else outside of us. As the prophet Jeremiah said,
Hey, Liz, here we go. Preach
Get it, Stephen.
Preach it.
the heart is deceitful and sick
Come on
beyond cure.
You gonna say it?
This is where I become charismatic.
Wow.
Holler, let's go.
Who can understand it? So let's talk. I mean, we've been talking about this, but I
you
want
say it
to
again?
I want to land here.
I won't interrupt this time.
The heart is deceitful and sick beyond cure. Who can understand it? I'm done.
The answer's God.
Yeah, thank you.
It's rhetorical, right?
Yeah,
It's
it was rhetorical.
Rhetorical question.
And recording.
But but the kind of before you got to that part,
and
Derek saying, it's actually your sinful tendency, your proclivity to sin is not actually a function of your circumstances or your upbringing, or
It's your choices.
That's a hard truth, and that is. I've seen and I've done plenty of just outsourcing. Well, I can't get over this sin because of X, Y, and
We
Z.
justify it. We make up excuses.
And even if we claim like the doctrine of total depravity, and like I believe it, man, but I'd be better if it wasn't for these things. But it's just so hard to like own that piece, even if you know it knowledge-wise.
So it feels like a bit of a trap, because I think it's a healthy lens. I think it's a necessary lens, but it could also be a shameful lens.
Of course.
But I think the first side of it being a necessary lens is that we have to be careful to not assume the health of a person. And I want to tiptoe around that, but I think in our culture, we can assume that what that person is saying or what that person is articulating is from a place of health.
Spiritually,
morally, whatever.
emotionally.
But if we know that each created being suffers from this at a varying level, some are more mature than others. I think we ought to look at that person, and this is where it's hard. Like, we can't look at that person just with caution and be like, well, what they said is, but I think we need to at least know that there is that underlying tendency, like prone to wander, Lord, we feel it, prone to leave the God I love, that old hymn, that we know that is true for all of us.
Right.
So, as Danielle and I interact during our workday, it would be easy for me to assume that Danielle is always healthy.
Right.
Or Mike is always healthy. But I need to, and I think that's the great accountability tool, is that I know, like, Mike might actually be struggling today, because he has a heart that wants to steer him away. Now, God in his grace has replaced that heart of stone with a heart of flesh. But the sin nature of man still leads us away at times. But I think, certainly in the culture that we live in, it's easy for us to sort of ignore that and just assume that that's the healthiest version of the person that I'm seeing today. And so therefore my radar is lower than maybe it needs to be.
So how would you do that without having the spirit we're talking about, this, like the Pharisees, where it's like more judgment? How would you mitigate that? Like, feel those feelings without turning it toward judgment? So
I think, the blanket is it needs to be done in relationship, right? But we also need to be aware of our own sin tendency. And so our pendulum can swing to extreme. And if we're not careful, I'm then evaluating Mike's sin nature through my sin nature. But because I have sin nature, it's going to then play out as self-righteousness. So I'm going to look at Mike through a self-righteous lens and go, well, Mike is more sinful than me, and that's how I'm now going to approach him. So there needs to be an awareness of my own prone to wander. And what that does is it humbles you before God. So hopefully you're coming to Mike and maybe his struggles, or Sarah and her struggles, with a level of humility.
Yeah, that's good.
And it's very complicated, obviously, right?
Totally is.
I just think we do ourselves, as a Christian community, we do ourselves a disservice when I assume that, or you assume that Stephen is the healthiest version of Stephen right now. Right. Like, it might actually be the most loving thing for you to ask, hey, are you okay right now? Are you doing okay? And it's not judgment. I just want to check in.
Yeah.
Because I know that you have a heart that's prone to wander. Where I think what we've done in the past incorrectly is just call out the sin, and then it becomes behavior modification, because then we're wrestling through shame and guilt. But anyway,
or the flip of that is, or to assume infallibility, maybe implied or not, or assume that someone is holier than thou and that they're the standard, and then all of a sudden, when that house of cards fall, even if it's not an intentional hypocrisy being built, but even if someone can be an incredible, humble servant of God, but if you elevate them in your eyes and all of a sudden they stumble, as we all do, that can cause it to come crashing down for you. So there's that's...
So the man after God's own heart, right? David, King David. He had a heart that was prone to wander, caused him to wander into adultery. Even Moses, right? A heart that was prone to wander, caused him to, in anger, strike a rock, and God said, you won't enter the promised land. And we see it in our world today, like all these lead pastors that are falling, and people are just so sick of the Western evangelical church now, because it's crumbling at the seams. But what we have done is exactly what you're saying, Mike, is we're going, well, Derek's the healthiest that Derek is, and Derek is the shining, and thank God that we have a pastor that doesn't want that.
Correct.
That he is constantly lowering himself. He's constantly asking for accountability, because, we know that
publicly, he does it publicly, personally,
100%.
But however, Derek is not perfect. Yep. Derek is not the end all be all. Neither is any of us here. And so it's...
I hope you're listening, Pastor Eric. Well, along those lines, let's give a couple practical ideas maybe for ways that we can, and I think one of the things that Derek does is one of these, ways that we can monitor our own heart. not behavior modification, ways that we can monitor the condition of our heart.
You got to create a safe space.
Yeah.
You have to have those people. It's not everybody.
No.
Not everybody has that privilege to speak into your life. But if you're aware of that tendency to wander, then get people around you. Get people around you. I said the most helpful thing and healthiest thing that happened to me is God gave me Tim Lager. And he probably will never listen to this, but Tim Lager was a guy that walked into my church when I was a young 20-year-old lead pastor. We were experiencing significant growth in our church. We were on the trajectory for all intents and purposes towards, great things, quote unquote. And he was the only one that was unimpressed by me. And it just drew me in. It was so intriguing. Like he looked beyond the perceived health.
Yeah.
And he started asking me how I was doing.
Yeah, that's good.
And I thank God for him.
Yeah.
I mean, I've thanked him personally many, many times. But it was that guy where I'm like, we may be surrounded by yes people, and he was the only no in my life, and I needed it, and it fostered other no's, and all of a sudden I had this beautiful eldership that actually, was asking real questions of me.
And it sounds like he was a tactful, gentle,
very gentle, very gentle. It was
in
never
that
harsh.
firmness. That was
Well, that's one of the ways you know whether it's right or not. Your spirits will kind of like knit in that.
Yeah.
That's cool.
I think for me, and I have a list of my own sinful tendencies, and some that I'm better at getting a hold of than others. But when I fall into one of them, if I can like get a half a second to think, like, okay, why did I act that way?
That's what I was going to say. The why question. That's
why
good.
did I try? Just like if I can get space to pause and ask myself, why did I get angry and yell at the girls in that? Oh, I'm stressed out because of the time, and then I can kind of try to identify that root behavior.
You really can't make any changes. I don't think. This is just where my head always goes. That's the kind of person I am. But you can't make any changes until you are very self-aware.
Correct.
You have to be aware of yourself. You have to admit that you have a problem. You have to admit that you're doing A, B, and C. You have to admit that this is something that needs attention. If you cannot do that, you're not going to get anywhere else.
What would be like one tip you would give people, like a journey on becoming self-aware? What's like one thing they could do?
I mean, from my own standpoint, like, what did I do for myself? Like, I don't know. I think it's just, I just got really sick and tired of my own behaviors.
Oh yeah, that's a path. Yeah, that's
like, I'm just sick of it. Like I'm doing it, like, and I just became, I don't really know.
Yeah.
I don't know.
That's good.
It's a repetition that you see that you just get tired of.
Just
look for what's the word? Themes?
Yeah, themes.
Repeating themes.
like, aren't you just tired of like doing the same thing over and over, and every time you do it, you feel so cruddy, but you're not like doing anything to try to better it. So the second you realize, like, okay, I'm going to end this like right now. You're still going to fall every now and then, but your perspective on it will be different.
So I had a dad. I'm just so blessed with my dad. He always led with the question, "What did you do?" And so I'll give an extreme example. I was jumped by 5 guys at school, and it was involving a girl and blah 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 blah. I probably deserved it. Whatever.
Did you get beat up pretty good?
I got beat up pretty good, and I went home.
Your dad said,
And that was the first question. And it wasn't condemning. Like, he sat me down. He was always very
but what
loving
was your
and
part
gentle.
in it?
Yeah. It was like, did you contribute to this?
Yes.
And I think if we do ourselves a service, if we can ask that question. So I think practically, I think about how can you identify themes in your life? Okay, so something may continue to happen. You may continue to lose friends.
Yes.
And our default is to blame the person. But if you can identify themes in your life, you're fired from jobs often. You're in the job for 2 years, you get fired. You're in the job for 2 years, you get fired. It was the employer's fault. It was the employer's fault. If there are themes that you can identify in your life, and I don't even think it takes a huge level of self-awareness to identify themes. I think you can grow in self-awareness or have a very small radar of self-awareness and still identify themes.
Sure, yeah.
Identify those themes and then just simply ask that question.
That's great.
What might I have contributed to that theme?
Why do I do that?
Yep.
And then, and then why? why did I do that?
That's great.
Yep.
Great. Good job. Okay, cool. So today's discipleship question is around the theme of discipleship failure. And the question's, what's holding me back from looking more like Jesus? Another great question in this journey to ask yourself. Just a reminder, you guys can go to whoisgrace.com/Mark for resources. You can also submit a question there. Let us know how you're feeling about things. And yeah, that's about it for today. So thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next week.
We did it.
We did it. Good job, everybody.
Bye.